Have relics been important in Buddhist practice?
Practically since the Buddha's final entry into nirvana, which coincided with his physical death. Buddhists have placed great importance on sacred relics. Numerous early accounts tell of the distribution of Buddha's cremated remains to political rulers so that they could enshrine them as sacred markers. One account says the great king Ashoka built 84,000 stupas as reliquaries for the Buddha's ashes. Some sources report that Buddha's followers discovered among the ashes a tooth, still intact. In Kandy, Sri Lanka, the shrine of the tooth claims to possess the only authentic dental relic, said to have been brought there 10 days after Buddha's death. But as recently as the late 1990s, a tooth kept in Beijing made news when it was flown to Hong Kong after the Chinese takeover there, in time for a celebration of the Buddha's birthday. Meanwhile, a tooth in the possession of a Tibetan monk was installed in Taipei, Taiwan. Amid mainland Chinese denunciations of its authenticity. Other relics of the Buddha included his staff, begging bowl, and robe. Another item that reflects the sacredness of first-class, actual bodily remains. And second-class relics, personal effects of the sacred person. And is still important throughout the Buddhist world is the Buddha's footprint. Many temples claim to possess an actual print, but most are highly stylized stone or metal images that devotees bathe with various liquids and adorn with flower petals. Prints frequently have various symbols of the Buddha on the sole. Most common are the Wheel of the Law and sets of either 32, 100, and 8. Or 132 special marks of the Enlightened One. Footprints belong to a third category of relic, items that directly remind one of the Buddha. All images of the Buddha, as well as physical copies of the sacred texts, are therefore also a type of relic. In addition to relics of the Buddha himself, symbolic reminders of numerous other holy persons have become prominent. First and second class relics of bodhisattvas, patriarchs, and eminent monastic founders and teachers are enshrined in stupas and pagodas throughout Asia. Miniature stupas and pagodas, made of wood, stone, or metal, have often provided the visual and devotional focus in temples, monasteries, and even private dwellings.
Have there been any Shinto mystics?
Mainstream Shinto tradition has not been particularly noted for producing important mystical figures. That is not to say that there have been no Shinto mystics. But talk of mystical union with the divine has come more from various syncretistic schools and sects, especially those heavily influenced by non-Japanese schools of religious thought. Kurozumai Muntada, founder of the Kurozumai sect with a distinctively Neo-Confucian tilt, taught the importance of the deliberate quest to become a kami. He himself is said to have experienced oneness with the sun goddess Amaterasu when she suffused his body.
What are some of the other religious days Christians observe annually?
Numerous fixed feast days recall the lives of important saints as well as significant moments in the lives of Jesus and his mother Mary. Two significant events in the life of Jesus include the day his parents presented the infant in the temple. February 2nd, the presentation. And the transfiguration in which he appeared in divine glory to several apostles, August 6th. Jesus' baptism by his cousin John is, in the Western liturgical tradition, a movable feast that always occurs within the first 2 weeks of January. Feasts honoring Mary include those commemorating her being conceived without sin, Immaculate Conception. December 8th, her birth, September 8th, her presentation in the temple, November 21st. Elizabeth's visitation with Mary, May 31st, and her bodily ascension into heaven, Dormition/Assumption, August 15th. In some churches well over half the days of the year are associated with holy persons, often commemorating the death date. A major saint such as John the Baptist might even merit an observance of both his birth, June 24th, and his death, August 29th.
Is there a central teaching or legislative authority for Jews?
During later biblical times, beginning around 200 BCE, a principal deliberative body of 71 members, called the Sanhedrin, Greek Synedrion, handled all religious and secular matters of importance to Jewish life. Originally located in the Jerusalem Temple, the Sanhedrin remained active until around 425 CE. Membership consisted of 3 groups, at least during New Testament times. The elders who represented the major tribal clans and families, the high priests, including elders of the 4 priestly families as well as former high priests, and the scribes. Religious legal scholars belonging mostly to the sect known as the Pharisees. The high priest, or Nasi, was chosen from descendants of Moses' brother Aaron and governed the council, while the Sanhedrin did function as a court of law in exceptional cases. It was concerned mostly with larger administrative and juridical issues. Meanwhile, the Bet Din, literally, house of judgment, generally adjudicated legal questions, including both religious and civil matters affecting the Jewish community exclusively. Roman law allowed for a large measure of internal rule among Jewish subjects. The Bet Din required at least 3, male judges but handled criminal cases with as many as 23 judges. The class of religious scholars known as the 5 pairs of teachers bore special responsibility for the 2 legal bodies. Hillel, Nasi, and Shammai, Av Bet Din, Chief Justice of the Court, were the last of the pairs. In this separation of civil and religious spheres, the high priest generally retained final authority. Though the Sanhedrin did not survive into late antiquity, the Bet Din remained vital through the Middle Ages. and still functions as arbiter of personal status law for Israeli Jews, with the chief rabbi presiding. During later antiquity, c. 500-1000, the scholarly class called the Janim, eminences, functioned as a major authority for Middle Eastern and European Jews by publishing their rulings in documents called responsa. For Jewish communities in Iraq, land of the exile, the position of exilarch, Resh Galuta, head of those in exile, generally occupied by laymen, continued to wield some authority until about the mid-13th century. For many generations, even up to early modern times, the Kehila, or local Jewish community organization, was the principal decision-making body.
Where does the word Muslim come from? Is it the same as Muslim?
Arabic is a Semitic language, as is its distant cousin Hebrew. Both languages are based on roots made up of 3 consonants. For example, many words can be derived from the root slm, shlm in Hebrew. Keep your eye on the uppercase letters to follow the root. A basic verb from that root, salima, means to be safe or whole. A related Arabic noun is salam, meaning peace, like the Hebrew shalom. Is part of a standard greeting among Muslims. When Arabic speakers want to build further meanings on a particular root, they do so by modifying the root with either prefixes, infixes, modifying interior letters, or suffixes. For example, to convey the notion of causing someone to be safe or at peace, one modifies the root salima so that it becomes aslama. In religious terms, to bring about a state of safety, peace, and wholeness, one has to get one's relationship to God in perfect order. That means letting God be God, and giving up all pretense at trying to do what only God can do, in short, surrendering to the supreme power. That state of surrender is called Islam. And a person who acts in such a way as to cause that state is called a Muslim. One of the first major non-Semitic languages early Muslim conquerors encountered was Persian, in which the U was pronounced as an O, and the I as an E. Hence the variation so common today, Muslim. Both mean exactly the same thing, the variations are entirely due to differences in pronunciation.
Have relics ever been important in Judaism?
Relics have generally not formed an significant part of popular Jewish practice. Reverence for the burial places of holy persons, however, does play a role. After the site of the former temple, tombs of the patriarchs and their wives have highest priority in the hierarchy of holy places. In the town of Hebron, not far south of Jerusalem and David's first capital, a mosque stands on what tradition identifies as the Cave of Machpelah. Accounts in the Hebrew Bible tell how Abraham bought the property as a burial place, and how generations of patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives, Sarah, Rebekah, and Leah, were laid to rest there. Rachel's tomb, not far from Bethlehem, has attracted pilgrims for over 1500 years. She was Jacob's favorite wife and the mother of his two youngest sons, Joseph and Benjamin.
How and where do members of local Christian communities come together?
Christians generally gather for worship in buildings called churches. Although numerous smaller groups meet in homes or places not set apart exclusively for religious functions. Some Pentecostal and holiness communities called their gathering places temples. Attached to many churches may be a variety of facilities such as schools, kitchens for catering community celebrations, auditoriums, social service offices, pastoral residences, monasteries, and convents. Libraries, shelters for the homeless and for battered women, soup kitchens, and cemeteries. In general, the larger the community attached to a particular institutional framework, the greater the diversity of facilities and the broader the social outreach is likely to be.
Where do Hindus live today? Any estimates of numbers available?
India is home to the vast majority, about 95%, of the world's nearly 1 billion Hindus. Other significant minority populations have Hindu communities in more than half a dozen other lands. Almost 24 million Hindus are Nepalese. Over 12 million live in Bangladesh, nearly 6 million in Indonesia, some 2 million in the United States, and approaching 1.5 million each in Malaysia, Pakistan, South Africa, and England. Virtually every nation on earth now has representatives of Hinduism among its citizenry. Hindus are about 200 million fewer than Muslims, half the total global population of Christians, and somewhere between 2 and 3 times that of Buddhism.
Do Christians pray in any particular language?
Use of sacred liturgical languages goes back to early Christian times. Aramaic and Hebrew were the languages the first Christians inherited from Jewish tradition. But before long Latin and Greek would become the dominant liturgical languages of Mediterranean Christendom, along with such regional Middle Eastern tongues as Coptic, Arabic, Armenian, and Syriac.
Are there Shinto rituals of marriage?
Weddings in Japan have traditionally followed Shinto ritual, and the vast majority still include Shinto elements even when performed in connection with other traditions, such as Christianity. Until recent times, however, weddings occurred in homes and were performed by laypersons only. Since the mid-19th century, shrine nuptials performed by Shinto priests have been more common. A ceremony called shinzenkeken, nuptials in the presence of kami, may take place in a wedding hall on shrine grounds or in other public spaces. According to some, a marriage deity called Musubi no Kami, the god who ties the knot, is a Japanese counterpart to the moon-dwelling deist, Yulao, who bound together the feet of marriage partners. Many Japanese continue the ancient practice of arranged marriage, and some young couples still live with the groom's family, following Confucian traditions. At the heart of the wedding ceremony is a shared drink of sake, rice wine. Many Japanese families still value elaborate ritual as a form of social communication. And some will even have two ceremonies, one Shinto and one Christian, for example. Deist-influenced traditions still recommend that couples be wed only on days determined to be auspicious.
Do Jews believe in angels? What about the devil?
A number of important biblical narratives seem to describe encounters between divine emissaries or messengers and major religious figures. 3 visitors tell Abraham that he and his barren wife will have a son in their old age, Genesis 18:1-15. Jacob dreams of a ladder to heaven on which messengers ascend and descend. Genesis 28:10-22, and later wrestles with a mysterious man, Genesis 32:22-32. Tradition has often interpreted these and dozens of other texts in the Hebrew Bible as referring to angels. The texts are often quite ambiguous and do not describe the mysterious actors as winged beings of light or in ways that many people today would recognize as characteristic of angels. These figures are generally understood as messengers from God, and only much later did they acquire the features now commonly associated with angels. Demonic or diabolical presences also appear in the Hebrew scriptures. Tradition has sometimes identified the wily serpent in Genesis as Satan or the devil, but not until the very latest books of the Bible, such as Job and Zechariah, do we find malevolent forces specifically called Satan. Post-biblical Jewish tradition often identifies Satan with the angel of death or with the innate human inclination to evil.
Is there a standard Buddhist liturgical worship?
Buddhist denominations that emphasize communal worship exhibit considerable variation in their services. Recitation of sacred texts is the single most common element. One Japanese Pure Land denomination uses the following order of service. After a call to worship expressing prayerful intent, worshippers pronounce the 3 refuges. Invoke the presence of the Buddha, praise him. Make a symbolic confession of sins, and recite the name of Amida Buddha 10 times. Then follows a segment of scriptural chanting, explicitly dedicated to rebirth in the Pure Land. Again invoking the name of Amida Buddha 10 times, worshippers reflect on its deeper meaning. Between two further invocations of the name they recite from the teachings of founder Honen. After a recitation of the vows of the Bodhisattva, the ritual concludes with the three refuges and a final prayer to send the Buddha back to his heavenly abode.
What are some of the other religious days Muslims observe?
On the 15th of Shaban, many Muslims, especially in South Asia, observe the Night of Forgiveness, Laylat al-Bara'ah, pronounced Baraa'ah. Popular belief says that the names of all persons are written on the leaves of a great cosmic tree. On the evening of the 14th, the tree shakes and loses some of its leaves. Those whose leaves fall are destined to die during the coming year. According to a hadith, God comes down to the lowest heaven that night and asks if anyone seeks forgiveness. That is the moment for all to wipe the slate clean, since no one knows whether his or her leaf has fallen. Celebrations of many holy persons, often centering around the individual's tomb, vary according to region. In addition to birthday, Mawlid, and death anniversary, URS, celebrations, Muslims in various places observe seasonal times. Mawsim, with festivities connected to agricultural or other natural cycles. One such celebration is that of Nabi Musa, Prophet Moses. Observed around his alleged tomb shrine near Jericho. Its timing coincides roughly with the Orthodox Christian Holy Week, featuring elaborate processions that begin in Jerusalem.
What rites do Hindus practice at home?
In their homes, many Hindus engage in a smaller scale version of temple puja, morning, noon, and evening. Miniature shrines often occupy a special corner, where all the necessary materials and implements for worship are kept. Puja beings with entering into the proper frame of mind and with invocations. Placing flower petals on the image, along with water and other elements, ghee, honey, milk, reminds devotees of the intimacy of their relationship with God. They symbolize that intimacy with actions and materials that communicate deep affection and warmth, both in the home and in the temple. God is the guest whom the host and hostess strive to make perfectly welcome. Making the deity beautiful often means clothing the images in elaborate garments as well. People sometimes invite a priest to come to their homes to pray, but generally the head of the household leads the home puja. Many Hindu householders regularly perform the individual morning prayer before sunrise. Facing east with the sacred thread over the left shoulder, worshippers take a sip of water, pronounce mantras over ashes, and place them on their foreheads, arms, ribs, and knees. To be purified of sin, they pray the Gayatri mantra, a lovely short hymn to the light of the sun. Several different forms of prayer might include facing the various cardinal directions while performing slightly different ritual actions. Other domestic rituals can include special celebrations associated with building and entering a new home for the first time. Other occasions marked with religious rituals at home include especially the various rites of passage associated with birth and early infancy.
Have prophets played a role in Confucian tradition?
Confucian tradition developed in ways very different from the so-called prophetic or Abrahamic traditions. Confucius and his disciples never claimed to have received a revelation from above. They did not consider themselves privy to divine secrets. Their job was to call people back to social responsibility, however. And in that respect they share an important characteristic with the classical prophet figures of other traditions. Confucius also felt himself called to speak of justice to those in power. Much as Israel's prophets and Islam's prophet Muhammad challenged the rulers of their day. But on the whole, Confucian tradition and its literati were much too closely identified with imperial rule to function as effective critics of the system. Some scholars distinguish between prophets as seers, and people of action, like Confucius, as doers. One such Confucian seer came at a time when Confucianism was waning as the theory behind CIT. Liao Ping, 1852–1932 CE, considered himself and Confucius prophetic figures. As it turned out, he was a minor player. Known perhaps best of all for his lament over the demise of imperial Confucianism. Think of him as the exception that proves the rule.
What are the 3 jewels and 5 vows?
Perhaps the closest thing to a summary of Buddhist beliefs is the brief creedal formula of the 3 jewels. I take refuge in the Buddha, I take refuge in the Dharma, I take refuge in the Sangha. Buddhists in various places and times have interpreted those jewels rather differently. For many the Buddha was a human teacher and an example, but no more. For many others, the Buddha represented the universal possibility of enlightenment. Still others regard the Buddha, along with countless Buddhists, to be called bodhisattvas, as a divine power and source of grace and salvation. Buddhist tradition retained the important Hindu term dharma but reinterpreted it. For Buddhists, dharma means all that the Buddha taught. They know dharma as enshrined in the sacred texts and communicated by religious teachers. The term Sangha means assembly and refers to the Buddhist order of monks and nuns and, by extension, to the whole community of believers. Along with the affirmation of the 3 jewels, a secondary but very important affirmation of the precepts or vows. Members of the monastic Sangha take 10 vows, while devout laypersons take the first 5. Many Buddhists begin their day by reciting the 3 refuges, and then adding the 5 precepts. They promise to refrain from killing, theft, unchastity, deception, and intoxication. Reaffirming one's commitment to the precepts functions not unlike a creedal statement of assent to the core beliefs of a religious tradition.
What is the Analects of Confucius?
Excerpts from Book 2 of the Analects. 1. The Master said, "He who exercises government by means of his virtue may be compared to the North Polar Star, which keeps its place and all the stars turn towards it." The Master said, "If the people be led by the laws, and uniformity sought to be given them by punishments, they will try to avoid the punishment, but they have no sense of shame. If they be led by virtue, and uniformity sought to be given them by the rules of propriety, they will have the sense of shame, and moreover will become good." The Master said, "At 15, I had my mind bent on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no doubts. At 50, I knew the decrees of heaven. At 60, my ear was an obedient organ for the reception of truth. At 70, I could follow what my heart desired, without transgressing what was right." Mang Idza asked what filial piety was. The Master said, "It is not being disobedient." Soon after, as Fan Chih was driving him, the Master told him, saying, "Mang I asked me what filial piety was, and I answered him, not being disobedient." Fan Chih said, "What did you mean?" The Master replied, that parents, when alive, should be served according to propriety, that, when dead, they should be buried according to propriety, and that they should be sacrificed to according to propriety. 10. The Master said, "See what a man does. Mark his motives. Examine in what things he rests.
What has the swastika got to do with Buddhism?
A revolving cross with bent cross beams. The swastika has been a symbol of longevity and success throughout Eastern Asia for millennia. Buddhists inherited the symbol from Hindu tradition, in which it referred to different forms of cosmic energy. Depending on whether the symbol rotated to the right or to the left. The symbol appears often in Chinese sculpture on the upper chest of the Buddha. There it is a reminder of the eternal validity of his teaching. A meaning attached to the Chinese use of the swastika as the number 10,000. In some Japanese temples, such as the Asakusa Kannon Temple in Tokyo, the swastika even functions as the central icon on the main altar, replacing the image of the Buddha. Zen tradition sees the swastika as a symbol of the Buddha mind handed down from teacher to disciple. It may have become associated with the Buddha as a result of his identification with solar imagery and power. Some suggest that the swastika symbolizes the Buddha's teaching as an abstract stylized version of the will of Dharma.
What issues have characterized Shinto's relationships to other traditions?
Shinto has important connections primarily to Buddhism and Confucianism, and secondarily to the Christianity that missionaries brought to Japan in the early modern period. During much of medieval and early modern times, Shinto and Buddhist leaders and teachers worked together at articulating points of theological cooperation between various schools of thought in the two traditions. That ongoing interaction resulted in the various types of Ryobyu, or two-sided, Shinto as well as other syncretistic denominations and sects. Such cooperation continued until the 13th and 14th centuries, when some Shinto thinkers developed belief systems in which Shinto stood at the top of a theological mountain. By the 17th century, the national learning movement began to offer a fully articulated interpretation of Buddhist-Shinto relations. Scholars suggested that the major figures of the Buddhist pantheon were nothing more than local forms of the kami, and that the emperor descended directly from the sun goddess, Amaterasu. Confucianism had by that time made its presence felt more vigorously than ever through its impact on courtly life and administration of the Tokugawa shogunate, 1600 to 1867. Confucian scholars and bureaucrats also contributed significantly to the Meiji Restoration in 1868, but the more closely Shinto theology came to be identified with the Japanese throne, the more it developed into a national ideology with little room for systems of belief considered. Non-Japanese Buddhism and Confucianism, first and foremost, but now missionary Christianity as well. Contemporary Shinto has once again become more open to interaction with other traditions, and Shinto leaders take it for granted that many who worship at shrines also maintain other religious affiliations. For many Japanese, the Kami way is not a separate system of religious beliefs. It is simply what all religious persons believe underneath all their otherwise distinctive doctrines. Shinto is therefore nothing less than the very essence of acknowledging the divine in the world.
What are the names of the Islamic months?
The 12 months of the Muslim calendar are Muharram, Safar, Rabi'i, Rabi 2, Jamada-I, Jamada 2, Rajab, Shaban, Ramadan, Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, and Dhul Hijjah.
How do deists and practitioners of CCT today determine their destinies with divination?
Most common of the methods are those that involve the use of bamboo sticks and crescent-shaped blocks. In CCT temples, devotees approach a barrel crammed full of long sticks containing combinations of trigrams called hexagrams, or Alternatively, numbers from 1 to 64, the total number of combinations of the 8 trigrams. Grabbing a handful of sticks, they shake them and then let them fall back into the barrel. Invariably one stick will protrude above the rest, and it provides the critical symbol for that individual to interpret. When sticks are numbered, devotees request a corresponding slip of paper from the temple staff. On the paper they then read an often enigmatic or poetic interpretation of the corresponding hexagram. Devotees can also drop a pair of crescent-shaped blocks with one smooth side symbolizing yang and one convex side symbolizing yin. Devotees pose questions as they drop the blocks. One yang and one yin side up means yes, while the other combinations mean no. Worshippers unsatisfied with a particular answer may simply continue dropping blocks until they receive the desired response.
How important are questions of assimilation and distinctiveness in religion?
Concerns over religious cohesiveness and identity vary with social and political circumstances. For example, in the former Yugoslavia, Croatian Catholics, Serbian Orthodox Christians, and Muslims managed a remarkably peaceful coexistence. When political disintegration followed the death of Marshal Tito, divisions along religious lines began to assume greater importance. That was not a direct result of differences in religious beliefs, but because age-old social divisions had occurred along religious lines centuries earlier. With the loss of political cohesiveness came the convenient demonizing of the others and subsequent ethnic cleansing. Most of the people of Bosnia, for example, had made little noise about their Muslim identity until they found themselves with little else to call their own. Serb propaganda warned of the imminent danger of a theocratic, fundamentalist Islamic State in their midst, the farthest thing from the minds of most Bosnian Muslims. Ironically, the loss of political standing has left the Muslims little choice but to reassert their religious distinctiveness. In the United States, concern over the danger of assimilation has likewise been linked to social factors. When Roman Catholics were still a small minority and subject to discrimination in several areas, they sought to maintain not only their Catholic distinctiveness but their nation of origin identities as well. American Jewish communities run the gamut from highly distinctive Orthodox and conservative to highly assimilated. New Muslim communities in the United States are now facing the same issues in a story yet to unfold.
Are there religious heroes? How are they different from saints?
Every culture has its heroes and heroines. Sometimes these pillars of strength and unusual ability represent largely secular or natural virtues. But in many instances heroes and heroines whose life stories are not Explicitly religious in origin gradually take on religious associations. One typical pattern is that a local heroic figure rises to prominence on a larger scale and becomes a sort of national hero. A religious tradition formerly unknown in the region moves in, perhaps arriving on the wake of military conquest and newly established political power, and eventually becomes the dominant religious influence in the area. Heroes and heroines who had formerly been characters in folk or royal epic tales begin to rub shoulders with the saints and other prominent religious personalities imported by the now dominant religious tradition. Before long, in the grand scheme of things, at least, but still generations or even centuries, the local or national heroes begin to acquire the characteristics and virtues of their religious counterparts. They may never rise to the status of saints, but they definitely qualify for the title of religious hero. By way of distinction, wonders attributed to a saint typically speak loudly of divine power. A religious hero's spectacular deeds, on the other hand, typically reflect a sort of natural perfection, now understood as part of a divine dispensation even if not a direct result of divine intervention.
What is the relationship between scripture and oral tradition?
Numerous traditions preserve their teachings only in oral form or in ritual performance. Several dozen Native American and African traditions, for example, keep their heritages alive in the recitation of tribal storytellers and in the ritual reenactment of myth in the form of narrative dance. Some communities of believers have found it necessary to commit their heritage to writing in order to prevent it from being lost, given the advanced age of those entrusted with preserving it. Even then, the written version remains somehow less than the real tradition, and the ideal remains oral and performative communication of the teaching. Since committing it to writing was a last-ditch concession to the frailty of human memory, it is interesting to note that even in some of the religious traditions that boast the most voluminous sacred literatures, scripture began and in some cases remained for many years as oral communication. In many of those traditions the written text came to occupy a place of authority nearly equal to that of the recited text. In some traditions, reliance on the book has rendered oral tradition virtually irrelevant.
Doesn't that suggest that Shinto is less than authentically religious? If it were, some argue, it hardly would tolerate multiple religious allegiances, would it?
Some point to Shinto's concern with the ordinary, the everyday, the natural world that surrounds us, and its lack of interest in transcendent mystery.
What are the basic features of the more elaborate shrine rituals?
Larger rituals typically include 4 features. Before beginning any sacred act, including the simplest ones. Celebrants purify themselves with water or salt. Welcoming the kami, kami mukai, is among the first acts of the presiding priest. The invocation is necessary because many matsuri begin away from the shrine in places where the kami does not ordinarily reside. Next is the offering to the kami, and that includes ancestors, as in Chinese traditions. In addition to responding to the obvious requirement of funds to maintain the thousands of shrines great and small all over the country, people make symbolic offerings and the priests in turn formally present them to the deities. Flowers, food and drink, beautiful textiles or jewelry, and even the performance of traditional art forms or sport can be included among offerings. Entertainment arranged in connection with a religious festival is known as divine amusement, gonnijiwai. When the priestly staff perform elaborate offerings, the chief priest opens the doors of the innermost sanctuary. The priests pass the offerings among themselves and finally the assistant chief priest places the offerings before the sanctuary doors. Ritual specialists then recite prayers, many of ancient origin and some more recently composed of praise. Thanksgiving, historical recollection about the meaning of the particular occasion. All concluded with appropriately humble leave-taking of the kami with a gesture called sending the kami away, kami okuri. Ceremonies conclude with a kind of communion rite in which the chief priest serves the other members of the ritual staff a symbolic sip of sake. The priests walk in procession from the inner worship hall to the outer hall for this rite, which is usually brief, depending on the number of officiants participating. When large crowds are in attendance for a particularly festive occasion, the closing meal can be quite elaborate, and include a share in some of the food just offered to the kami. One ritual element notably lacking in Shinto worship is preaching. Since worship is entirely focused on relating ritually to the deities, Shinto tradition does not regard persuasive religious rhetoric a necessary tool.
Do all traditions have savior figures or redeemers?
Virtually every tradition acknowledges that life is full of difficulties. But not all teach that someone else can rescue people from their problems. Theravada Buddhism, for example, emphasizes self-effort following the example of Buddha the teacher. Sunni Islam teaches that only surrender to God can bring a person's life to a good end. Some saviors, such as bodhisattvas in Mahayana Buddhism, effect salvation for humanity purely by extending their power so that individuals are lifted out of their suffering. In those instances, the Savior remains largely above human misery. Some, such as Jesus Christ, work their saving deeds by redeeming or buying back a lost humanity. The notion of redemption presupposes that a savior figure spends him or herself as a kind of ransom. Identifying profoundly with the plight of humanity, This kind of redemptive suffering is relatively rare. Some traditions in which saints are prominent underscore the suffering of some holy persons. But they do not generally effect salvation through their pain.
What is the connection between orthodoxy and heresy, and what is heterodoxy?
Orthodoxy, from the Greek orthodox, correct opinion, is in a way the diametric opposite of heterodoxy, Greek, heterodox, variant opinion. Heterodoxy is a generic category used to refer to any and all doctrinal views at odds with mainstream thinking in a tradition. Heresy, from the Greek herio, to seize, choose, decide, in other words. To take a position, is one of the more common ways of characterizing heterodox views. In general, heresy refers to the deliberate holding of a set of beliefs in direct opposition to a religious tradition's established and widely accepted authority. It is important to keep in mind that fully articulated conceptions of orthodoxy typically develop long after the earliest generations of a given tradition have come and gone. During their early decades, even centuries in some cases, many religious traditions have historically allowed for some diversity of views. But one or another of those views can become so extreme that a majority of believers perceive a threat to their cohesiveness as a community. To hold such a threat at bay, religious communities sometimes find it necessary to define the limits of acceptable divergence of beliefs. The term heretical has sometimes been used to describe certain sectarian movements that form in response to restrictive definitions of orthodoxy.
Are any other regular observances significant in the Jewish ritual year?
"3 days of fasting and mourning, 2 in summer and 1 in winter, are connected to remembrance of the first and second temples. Tesha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a day of lamentation for the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. Israeli Jews and pilgrims gather at the western wall of the Herodian temple to grieve over the loss. The short biblical book called Lamentations is a traditional reading for the occasion. Associated rituals have given the remains of the temple the popular name the Wailing Wall. 8 days after Hanukkah, on the 10th of Teves, another fast commemorates the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's initial siege of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. In more recent times, the occasion has become associated with mourning for victims of the Holocaust. On the 17th of Tammuz, a less popular occasion, some Jews fast to recall the times when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar and Titus first broke through the walls of the temple in 587/6 BCE and 70 CE, respectively. Finally, there are 2 other minor observances. One is the 15th of Shavat, the New Year for trees, Rosh Hashanah Eli Ilanot, a day of thanks to God for the bounty of the earth. The other is called Sinchat Torah, rejoicing in the Torah. The day after the Feast of Booths, Jews celebrate the end of the annual cycle of liturgical readings, with processions in which the scrolls are carried around the synagogue with children leading the crowd.
Are there Shinto hierarchical structures?
Like so many other religious traditions, Shinto community structures often reflect the belief that human life mirrors divine life. Just as there is at least an implicit hierarchy among divine beings, human society needs a certain degree of structure. Long-standing Japanese tradition, much influenced and reinforced by Confucian teaching over the centuries, lays great emphasis on knowing one's place in society. Each individual stands in a relationship of higher to lower, or vice versa, with his or her fellow human beings. And basic etiquette requires that one be aware of social subordination in every context. Everyday Japanese speech, with its various levels of polite address, reflects that awareness. Although contemporary Japan is a democratic society, with all the political institutions needed to support a democracy, hierarchy runs deep in the culture, and so too in Shinto belief and practice. Everything, from ranks within the network of shrines to division of labor among ritual specialists, mirrors that awareness of multi-level structure in society at large. For several centuries in the early history of Shinto, 4 groups were responsible for most Shinto ritual. The Nakatomi family oversaw ritual generally, the Imbe family were concerned with maintaining ritual purity. The Urabe family focused on divinatory rituals so as to know the divine intentions in all matters. And shrine musicians performed the divine entertainments. Other powerful clans or families held and relinquished positions of power and influence over subsequent centuries.
What could be good about such a day?
It represents the ultimate sacrifice by which God redeemed the world through the offering of the only Son. For Christians, this is at the heart of the mystery of salvation. Special services acknowledge the sanctity and somber nature of the occasion. Some churches feature an extended reading of one of the Gospel accounts of the Passion and Death of Jesus, while some perform classic musical settings. Others commemorate the events of the day with a ritual called the Stations of the Cross, the 3 hours ritual recalling the time Jesus spent on the cross, or by reenacting Christ's deposition from the cross and burial. Pilgrims to Jerusalem on this day participate in a lengthy procession through the streets of the Old City, retracing, at least in part, the steps of Jesus toward Calvary or Golgotha, the hill of the crucifixion. In liturgical Western churches, the day ends with the stripping of the altar, leaving a bare table and an empty tabernacle, where the consecrated bread is ordinarily kept, as symbols of mourning. Holy Saturday memorializes the day of waiting and uncertainty experienced by Jesus' followers. who hoped his predictions of a victory over death would prove true. Some churches celebrate a special ritual on Saturday at midnight or earlier in the evening in anticipation of Easter.
Are there characteristically Christian views about religion and political power?
Views about church-state relations have varied over the centuries among Christian groups. Bearing in mind that the following is an oversimplification of a very complicated issue, it is possible to characterize four principal positions on this issue. At some times and in some places, Christians have thought of the state as virtually synonymous with the Church. The early years of the Church of England as proclaimed by Henry VIII, and the Byzantine Church under Constantine are examples. Some traditions have accorded the state enormous power over the Church. As with early Lutheranism in Northern Europe. Reversing the situation, the Church has sometimes dominated the state. As during the heyday of Calvinism in Switzerland. Finally, certain communities of the Radical Reformation proclaimed a total separation of church and state, insisting on their right to reject some aspects of ordinary corrupt society altogether. Some descendants of those communities continue to practice conscientious objection with respect to compulsory military service, for example. Throughout history prior to the Reformation, popes often had stormy relationships with the monarchs of the Mediterranean world. The result was a variety of official church positions ranging from supremacy over temporal power to an attempt at equal balance between the spiritual and the temporal, to de facto admission that the civil authority held supremacy.
What have been the principal venues for Confucian communities and CIT?
Three main kinds of sacred spaces have been at the center of activities. Several kinds of venue called memorial halls enshrine the spiritual presence of great literati. Beginning with Confucius himself and his ancestors. These facilities go by the generic name Wenmiao, Temple of Literature/Culture. While those specifically dedicated to Confucius are often called Kong, or Kongzi Miao. Until at least the middle of this century, Confucian temples enjoyed prestigious locations in nearly every Chinese city as well as many Korean and some Japanese cities. In most Confucian temples, one of the more important community functions has been that of a place of study. These temples tend to draw clientele from a wider area than do CCT temples, which function more like local parishes. Unlike Buddhist and CCT temples, Confucius temples do not hum with the ritual devotions of a steady stream of worshippers. There the ritual is more likely to be quiet academic work in the side rooms provided for that purpose. Once dedicated to the reading of the Confucian classics, these rooms now provide students whose homes are crowded and noisy a chance to concentrate on any academic subject. Second in importance and number are three different types of altars for the worship of agricultural deities. Natural powers of mountain and river, and ancestral spirits. Generally set in a shared compound were the first two kinds of altar, 20-foot square platforms, walled in and facing west. Temples of the imperial cult, finally, could be either of grand scale, as in Beijing's Temple of Heaven, or relatively humble, as in a local temple to the earth deity. All three venues provided a variety of circumstances under which communities have come together.
What are mystics?
Mystics are those who have special insight into the deepest of spiritual mysteries. They often report first-hand, direct experience of realities far beyond the ordinary. There are some apparent similarities in the accounts of mystics across traditions. In a number of traditions we find two principal types of mystical experience. One is a highly personal encounter between the human subject and the divine reality, in which there is no permanent loss of individuality. This type is sometimes called theistic or dualistic mysticism. Another describes the mystic as utterly absorbed, annihilated, lost in a largely impersonal cosmic reality. Monistic is the name often used to describe this second type. There are equally telling differences from one tradition to another, and it is misleading to conclude that all religious traditions come together in mysticism. Especially in instances of theistic mysticism we find that the subject invariably describes the object of the experience in terms distinctive of his or her tradition. Christians encounter Christ and Mary, Muslims receive guidance from Muhammad, and Hindus merge in loving union with Shiva, for example. There are surely points of important crossover in the mysticisms of the various traditions. Still, the differences remain and must be acknowledged.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Daoism or CCT?
Most of the various schools and sects of Daoism can point to at least one source or compendium of their central teachings. In that sense, there is such a thing as Daoist doctrine. A body of doctrine does, in effect, define the boundaries of some of the schools, especially the more esoteric ones, and sets them apart from one another. But even in those instances, the doctrinal core is largely subordinate to a given school's central rituals and practices. CCT, on the other hand, does not define itself according to any clearly articulated doctrinal system. Children learn from their parents and extended family of elders a host of convictions and practices of the sort often called folk beliefs. Where there is no formally defined doctrine, there can be no dogma in the sense of a minimum required for membership. Of those Daoist schools and sects that have developed distinctive doctrinal tenets, Only the most esoteric have even approached the kind of official dogmatic pronouncement one finds. For example, in Roman Catholicism.
What is holy?
Originally a fertility festival, this late winter celebration of several days, ending with the full moon of Fulguna, is named after the demoness Holika. She was in the habit of eating a child each day until a holy widow summoned all the children to curse the demoness together. Amid great hubbub, participants today let out the kind of energy the children must have unleashed on Holika. They throw multicolored powders and liquids on each other. Evidently a visual remnant of the children's curses. By a fascinating process of association, the celebration has also come to embrace the mythological downfall of evil female figures. For example, Krishna destroyed the demoness Putana, whom the evil king Kamsa had sent, disguised as a wet nurse, to kill the infant deity by poisoning him with her breast milk.
Have Confucians traditionally sent out missionaries to convert others?
Confucius was genuinely convinced that his ethical views and integrated approach to just government under the dominion of heaven had much to recommend them. He himself was a zealous advocate and spent much of his life trying to convert others to his interpretation of the human condition. When at length the Confucian system took hold as the theory behind the practice of imperial administration, the bureaucratic structure itself became the mechanism that spread Confucian thinking far and wide. Diplomatic relations with other lands became a network for the export of the Confucian way. But neither Confucius nor his most influential disciples were populists. Instead of preaching to the masses as missionary movements typically do, Confucians have espoused a trickle-down theory. Convince the leaders of the value of Confucianism and they in turn will spread the word to their subjects. Persuade those in authority to model the good society. Given appropriate official sanctions and incentives, the people will see the benefit of establishing proper relationships at every level.
Are there distinctive forms of Islamic initiation?
Teenagers can be welcomed formally into the adult community of believers with a simple ceremony, during which the young man or woman pronounces the Shahada before 2 male or 8 female witnesses. Sometimes the occasion is combined with a regular congregational prayer service on Friday afternoon. But the ritual can also take place in the home. The young Muslims so initiated may also recite various prayers in Arabic as part of the ceremony. There is ordinarily no reception following the ritual. As a rite of passage, the ritual itself is roughly parallel to the Jewish bar and bat mitzvah.
What about observances related to the locality or indigenous practice?
In many parts of the world, Buddhists celebrate New Year's Day on January 1st. The observance is not a specifically Buddhist tradition but has become associated with it through a process of syncretism. Japanese Buddhists observe the spring and autumn equinoxes on March 21st and September 21st respectively. A festival honoring the dead, called Abon Matsuri, occurs between July 13th and 15th. Chinese All Souls Day. A parallel festivity, celebrated during the 7th lunar month. Features offerings thought to assist 7 generations of deceased relatives. A good example of an observance linked specifically to a single region is the celebration of Buddhist Churches of America Founding Day on September 1st.